Welcome to the Organisational Inclusionist. I'm your host, Grace Mosuro. In this podcast series, we'll be delving deep into the pressing issues surrounding equality, diversity, and inclusion in both the workplace and the broader world. My goal is to foster understanding, inspire change, and amplify the voices of those advocating for a more inclusive and equitable society. Throughout this series, I'll be engaging in candid discussions with leaders, experts, activists, and changemakers from various fields. We'll explore the challenges, successes, and evolving landscapes of equality, diversity, and inclusion. From dismantling systematic biases to promoting equal opportunities for all, we'll touch on a broad range of topics. But we won't stop at discussing problems. We'll actively seek out solutions and actionable steps to drive positive change. Our aim is to inspire and empower you, our listeners, to take an active role in making the world a better place for everyone. This is the Organisational Inclusionist. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Organisational Inclusionist. My name is Grace Mosuro and I am your host, and today I am joined by Ettie Bailey-King, an inclusive and accessible communication educator. Today's episode is going to be about moving the needle on DEI and avoiding tricky topics, or why organizations are still avoiding tricky, I say tricky with quotation marks because I don't think it's tricky, but that tends to be the argument, tricky topics like race and increasing diversity in leadership and consulting. So I met Ettie virtually, and I actually reached out to Ettie because of a really compelling post that she did, which kind of spoke to what I've been thinking for a while and just made me think, wow, this is a white woman basically challenging the view that, or challenging the fact that we do see a lot of DEI roles being held by white women, and the impact that that can then have on DEI and how it's rolled out in organizations. So I reached out to Ettie on LinkedIn. I was like, girl, I need you to come on the podcast to talk about this. Because I do think it's really important that when we are part of a community and we feel a certain way, that we talk about that. I think sometimes, we can avoid the tricky or the sometimes uncomfortable conversations because we don't want to upset people. But I think working in DEI, it's really important that we kind of lean in to the discomfort and really do what we need to do to impact and affect change. So Ettie, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really, really excited to have you. And before we get stuck in, I would love it if you could please give our listeners a bit of an intro into who you are and the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here. So I am Ettie Bailey-King. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an inclusive and accessible communication educator. And what those two bits mean are basically on the inclusive language side, it's about recognizing that a lot of harm, so racism, ableism, sexism, classism, all of that, some of that can happen through words and through the stories that we tell and who we have in mind when we're designing systems, which is influenced by the stories we tell and the words that we use. And so some of that harm can happen through language, and also some of the repair can happen through language. So I train people, mainly copywriters, content creators, comms people, that kind of thing, but actually kind of everyone who communicates, which is all of us. And I train people to just use language that is specific, accurate, clear, useful, and usable. And I focus on, well, lots of topics, but particularly disability, race, age, gender, sexual orientation, that kind of thing. And I also work on the accessibility side of things, which is helping people to communicate in a way that works better for ADHDers, blind people, deaf people, autistic people, tired people, distracted people. So once again, all of us. Anyone who communicates, which is, all of us here.
Amazing. I love it. I think the other thing that I failed to mention in my kind of preamble at the start of this is, for our listeners, can you feel Ettie's energy like through your screen? Because this is one of the things that I really warmed to when we first spoke as well, Ettie, is like, despite the field that you work in and the work that you do, which we both know can sometimes be quite emotionally draining, your energy is just up there. Like, you are without a doubt someone that just warms the heart.
Thank you.
No
That's so
worries.
lovely of you to say. And I feel like we'll get onto this later in your excellent questions, but I think it's sort of setting people up for what will come later in terms of like the why of why we do our work is so serious, so intense. yeah, like is the highest stakes, but the how of how you do it can be really light. It can be like it matters for the absolute highest reasons, but the sort of how of you do it is not that deep, is actually not like doesn't need to cause Graham in HR to completely like feel like he can't handle it. It's like you can handle it. It's not that hard. We've all got this.
Right. So, the post. So, what led you or what inspired you to write that post when you did it?
So, for a bit of background, it was a slightly spicy post about me. I was feeling a lot of frustration and irritation with the way that white women, no shade against white women, I am one, I love white women, but the way that white women take up space in fields that we have a part in, like, so in DEI, white women absolutely have a really important role to play. And I'm not one of those people who thinks that in anti-racism, white people should completely get out of the way. I think we have really, really, really important roles to play. But
Mhm.
what I see around me is quite a lot of white women shaping systems and processes that don't actually so that they meet white women's needs and not the needs of the people who need them the most.
Mm.
And we know from research out of Harvard University and some other studies that white women are the main beneficiaries of affirmative action programs in the USA. And just anecdotally, my experience of the white women that I know in DEI, a few of them are doing incredible, really, really powerful, genuinely anti-racist and anti-ableist work. Amazing. Love seeing that. But quite a lot of them are in places where they could be trying to actually tear down and dismantle racism and ableism and classism and all of that. And they're actually not doing that. They're basically carving out a space that works for other white middle class cis-het women like them, white women, and then kind of pulling up the ladder for everybody else. And I just felt really frustrated and I wanted to say something about it. So I basically put out there this idea that I'm seeing too many white women shaping solutions so that they meet their needs and not the needs of everybody and the people who most need solutions.
Mm. No, I completely agree. I've posted a couple of times about like I don't love gender equality policies because historically I've only ever seen them benefit white women. I've never seen the impact of those policies on someone that looks like me. So whenever I've worked in an organization that has really driven that, I've definitely seen, some amazing affirmative action for white women and I've celebrated them. But then when I've kind of gone, what about me? The question is, what do you mean we're really diverse? Look how many women we have on the board. Okay. I think what I find really interesting as well, so the Harvard research that you mentioned, to me really speaks to the fact that, and I talk about this a lot, people are still really not keen on addressing race equity, which is why we see, affirmative action essentially in the main benefiting, I'm going to keep that in. Benefiting white women because white men who are traditionally in power are happy to support white women because they look like them, minus the gender element. And then we've seen obviously a lot of anti-DEI rhetoric in the States and some of it flowing down into the UK because we're now talking about affirmative action for Black people. And for me, that has been something that I've had to call out. It's like, actually, when we're talking about equality, everyone's okay with it until we say, no, actually, what about race? You guys still aren't tackling that. You're not addressing it. And that's when everyone goes, forget this DEI woke nonsense. This is racist. Like all of this. It absolutely cracks me up. So, but cracks me up in the way where it's like, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. Like it's not I'm really jolly about this. This is actually crazy and frightening. But what impact do you think that, you've mentioned about women benefiting from affirmative action from the research that we've seen in Harvard and obviously some of the things we see in the UK. But what impact do you think that has on, and you did speak to some of this, but anything more specific or just more detail on the impact that you think or you've seen that have on DEI initiatives within organisations?
Yeah, I just really want to take a moment when you were talking there about laughing, because if we wouldn't, we would cry. That resonates with me so much, that feeling of like, we're laughing because this is absurd, but my word, there's a line between absurd and hilarious and just kind of mind melting.
Right.
I think so. Yeah, I'll speak to the impact as I see it on DEI initiatives, and I kind of want to frame it with a bigger question around what do people believe that is happening? What do people think DEI is? Because you have some people, quite often white men, who essentially see DEI as kind of like a zero-sum game. They're like, resources will be taken away from me, opportunities will be taken away from me. Like, it's a pie, and you're going to take away some of my slices, and I will have less. And for anyone who is familiar with the work of like Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun, who wrote this amazing paper called The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, it's this idea that a lot of people in mainstream organizations sort of subscribe to this set of values, which are loosely called white supremacy culture. And they include these ideas that sort of like, for example, like worship of the written word, believing there's one right way to do stuff, believing that somebody else's success is your failure. And I just see this sort of like zero-sum thinking all the time
Yeah.
around power holders. And it's so funny to me because firstly, just like not true. It's not pie. Like, if you want talented people around you, then investing in DEI means you're going to have more brilliant colleagues who are going to support you to do brilliant things. Like, why would you not want that? But also because, and there's an amazing quote from the Combahee River Collective, which I will share because it just is so powerful. And there's a quote from the collective, and they say, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. And I think about that all the time, because when a white man is worried about DEI coming in and ruining things in his organization, there's an opportunity to see it the other way around, which is that if they started doing things anti-oppressively, they would be more free to express feminine values and behaviors, and their colleagues who are fat or are in bigger bodies would be free to exist in their bodies because like anti-fatness would be tackled, and everything else would kind of shift in a way that I see as really powerful and expansive and joyful. So I think like sort of trying to use that to shape how I answer this, I guess I see the impact as being that DEI gets perceived as this like, yeah, this risky, scary thing that's going to come in and take stuff away from you. They perceive it also quite often as being, like I mentioned at the start, like a bit more terrifying and radical and difficult than it has to be. Actually, maybe I'll take away radical because I think it should be radical. I think we should be getting to the root of things. To quote Angela Davis, that's all radical means. It means getting to the root of deep problems. But I feel like what we see in DEI is more and more of this sort of panic, and senior leaders, often white people, kind of withdrawing into themselves, feeling very threatened, very attacked. And it just feels like we're kind of placing the focus on the wrong place. But if we see it as everyone will benefit, if we dismantle these systems, everyone is more free, everyone can show up in different ways, we can allow different skills and attributes and behaviors into the workplace, we can divest from this very narrow idea of professionalism, and then I'm going to say Graham again because I've got Graham in my mind, this hypothetical person that I've worked with many times, you can also inhabit other ways of being. So I just see it all as like benefit to everybody, basically. But I think the impact from where I am is that it feeds into people's fears, and it feeds into this notion of DEI as something that will take things away from them.
No, absolutely. And I always talk about, I see inclusion as being the great multiplier. And I think that really speaks to the quote, and what you've said is this view that actually once everyone is free, like everyone is then free to thrive and to excel. And I think that quote as well is so interesting because this is something that's, many organizational leaders still don't kind of accept, is where Black women rank in the order or the hierarchy when it comes to life, when it comes to opportunity, and when it comes to diversity and inclusion initiatives. And that quote really speaks to the fact that actually, if you tackle the biggest issue, which is inclusion for Black women, that is your hardest issue to tackle. If you can solve that, everything else is going to be a piece of cake, not pie, cake, right?
Cake.
So no, I absolutely agree with that. But the other thing I think that that I still find quite challenging is I still hear it too often, as far as I'm concerned, this let's get comfortable with being uncomfortable reference or term when we talk about tackling diversity and inclusion within organizations and within society. My view personally is, as far as I'm concerned, if as a leader in an organization, whether you're driving inclusion or you're just driving performance in your organization, you shouldn't want to be comfortable until everyone in your organization is comfortable. Forget that. Let's get comfortable with being. No. My call to action is actually, I request and I implore you to think about, actually, my comfort as a leader should come second. It should come last to the comfort of everyone in my organization. And if they're not comfortable, I definitely don't want to be uncomfortable. So I'm going to lean into this piece of work. But what do you think drives that discomfort that we still very much see in this space and within organizations?
When I hear that, when I hear people talking about, for example, anti-racism as being inherently uncomfortable work, I just hear white comfort and the centering of white perspectives. Because don't get me wrong, of course, anti-racism work can be incredibly difficult and challenging. It's not easy, it's not effortless. It can bring up racial trauma if it's done badly, and actually even when it's done well, like we know that the pain of racism can and will come up for people. But I think that word uncomfortable, when you hear someone say, "Oh, anti-racism sounds uncomfortable," typically when you probe and ask people what they're describing, they will, in my experience, tell you more specific scenarios. They'll tell you about how it sort of makes them cringe and worry about getting into trouble. And they'll often end up speaking from this like imagined white perspective, where they're like, "Oh, anti-racism is uncomfortable because it means owning up to your complicity, or having to use words that you feel uncomfortable with, or talking about stuff that seems impolite." So actually it's like, well, comfortable for who? As you've like perfectly summed up there, Grace, who's currently comfortable in the status quo? It might be white people who are never having to confront the ways in which we are perpetrating harm. But if all your colleagues of colour are currently uncomfortable, then there's no such thing as breaking the comfort levels. It's just about transferring it. If we're happy for an entire group of people to be constantly uncomfortable in the status quo because we so value the, let's say, white senior leaders' ability to feel like everything's fine and dandy, we're literally saying that some people's well-being and their ability to sleep at night is worth less than others. So when people say that, I always probe and say, like, comfortable for who? Tell me more about that. What comes up for you when you think about that? But I also then will tend to share perspectives from other people, because, again, at least in my experience and among all the wonderful like anti-racism educators and consultants that I've been lucky enough to work with, uncomfortable is almost never the word that comes up. People will say it's been transformative, it's turned me inside out, it's been perhaps exhausting, perhaps deeply challenging, it's made me see things from a new perspective. But it's not that sort of like cringe of awkwardness. It's just like, this is big and serious work, we're going to do it, we're going to tackle it. But it's not about like it's probably like less accurately summed up as being uncomfortable. When I hear that, I just think white comfort and the idea that white people should be as comfortable as if they're having a bubble bath all the time, which is so oppressive. And that's how all these isms keep going.
It's so funny as well. I completely agree. I think that there's almost a need, no, definitely a need, I think, for white people working in ED&I or leading organizations that maybe aren't as inclusive as they could be, and they need to do the work. There's this need to separate yourself from it. Like, I think that it turns into a me situation when you spend all your time thinking about, this is uncomfortable for me, or, this is going to make me feel this, or I might do this. Completely remove yourself from the situation. This isn't about you. And I heard someone say this amazing quote, which is similar to one that I've heard before, but she basically said, this isn't about what you've been through. This is about what you've not been through. And I was like, I love the way you've just said that. Like, that is actually perfect. This isn't about you. And I think that when we frame it and we look at it in that way, that we think, actually, this isn't anything to do with me or my experiences. This is about me learning about other people's experiences and being part of the change to support those experiences being different and better in the future. I think that in itself then makes inclusion feel empowering. If you're someone from dominant cultures who actually takes that view of, actually, this is about me understanding the things that other people experience that I don't, that then becomes something that you run into. It's something you want to learn. It's something that you feel is going to make you better, but also make other people's lives better. And I think just reframing it mentally is really, really important. The other random thing I was going to say was that I find bubble baths really uncomfortable. I hate them. I hate them. Over fashion. I'm like, I can literally last maximum 5 minutes. And even then I'm sweating. I'm like, who does this for hours? I don't get it. I just don't get it. But
See,
yes.
I'm one of those people who will voluntarily like boil myself. I'm like a lobster. I'm like, this is perfect. Make it hotter. Does the water go hotter? No.
I can't do it. I need to work out what the trick is. Like, is there certain things I'm going to Google it. I'm actually going to do some research on the perfect bubble bath. I'm going to try different ones and see if my view changes, but not loving them at the moment.
I was gonna say, when you were talking about people taking things personally, it reminds me again of yet another of those characteristics of white supremacy culture, which is that kind of wanting to individualize everything
Yeah.
and wanting to make, we make success stories into like this one CEO built the company of the decade, and it's like, no, he didn't. He had a team around him. Like, he's fantastic, but we kind of fetishize like individual achievement, one person seemingly standing up against impossible odds, when
Mhm.
actually it's a much more interesting story to see things as collective, because they always are. And I think like that individualization of systemic problems is just so dangerous. Like, if you have, let's say, a CEO who's interpreting getting told about racism in their company as a personal failing, not only is that, I think, an unfair burden to carry. I don't think one person can be made responsible for stuff that's right
Mhm.
out there in the culture everywhere, but it's going to put us into shame. And I just read this amazing book by Dr. Devon Price called Unlearning Shame, and it's really changed my perspective on things. But just one of the brilliant nuggets in there was just about that impact of whenever we go into a shame place, that it closes down our thinking and stops us taking action. And
Really.
that you always have the option of just responding expansively and being like, I've got a part to play in this. Or like the way that I teach people in my work, when I'm teaching people about inclusive language, I'm like, doesn't mean you're a bad person if you find yourself thinking things that are not expressed very inclusively. We've all grown up around myths and stereotypes. Of course they're there in your
Exactly.
mind and your memory. I always find myself saying things I don't quite mean. We don't have to individualize it and make it into heroes and villains. It's just about learning better and doing better every time.
Definitely. I always say, when we know better, we do better. I didn't coin the term, but I love it and I run with it. I Again, another really random one, because I am quite random. I went to get my eyelashes done yesterday. The lovely woman that was doing them, it was my first time with her, and I lay down, and the small talk started, and she said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm Nigerian." And she said, "Oh, that's interesting. You're quite light for a Nigerian woman. A lot of my clients are Nigerian, and they're usually a lot darker than you." And I lay there thinking, what in the world are you talking about? Because Nigerians come in all shades and sizes, shades and colors, whatever. Like, I don't know one Nigerian that is the same complexion. Um, but then I was like, oh gosh, there's more to come. She's going to say more. And then she went on to say, "You've actually got a really nice complexion." And I lay there thinking, colorism is at its finest, right? She said that to me. She thought it was a compliment. Like, she thought it was a compliment. And I lay there thinking that, in the work that I do, I honor the fact that as human beings, we have all grown up believing the myth that is race, right? And colorism is a big part of racism that we don't talk enough about. But I sat there just thinking, wow, like, she said this with so much conviction. And part of me in my inclusion strategist and coach mind was like, I need to coach this woman. But then the other part of me was, she doesn't know me very well. How's she going to take it? So I just said to her, well, actually, like, my family is all different shades. Like, Nigerians are, we come in all different colors. But in my head, I was just like, this is wild. What are you implying? That dark skin isn't beautiful? Like, it really speaks to the legacy of slavery, where, the dark skinned slave was worth less, and literally they paid less for them, and they made them do the horrible labor. And we still see colorism playing out in hierarchies in organizations, and in pay that people receive, and in public and societal beliefs that actually the lighter your skin is, the more beautiful you are. But I felt like I needed to do my bit in that conversation, in providing that woman with some information that hopefully will make her do better, because she knows better now, I hope. But it was just a stark example of the fact that there is still so much work to do and so much educating that we need to do, but also the need for us to lean into that. Like, I was really uncomfortable having to kind of call out a microaggression in the softest way I could, trust me. Like, I didn't call it out in the way that I would have liked. But, microaggressions traditionally come from the nicest people, because they don't know, they don't know. And it's really important that we as individuals take ownership of what we don't know, and give ourselves space to learn, and not do it in a way where we make ourselves villains. I believe in intent, and if your intent is to do better, then, just run into that learning, essentially. So
I'm so struck there by like how it's like, can a woman not get a day off? Can you
right.
not just get an hour off to get your eyelashes done? Like, is there no safe place where you can be away from all of these isms? And I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the time there is no respite from that. And I think that example that you've shared is so helpful for me, because I'm always thinking about this tension between, as I call it in my work, maximum challenge but maximum compassion. So if I'm training you on anti-ableist language, and we're doing a masterclass on talking about disability and making your content more accessible, there will be maximum compassion in the sense that I'm not out to like attack anyone individually or imply that they're a bad person. It's just not coming from that energy. It wouldn't be useful if it came from that energy. But there will be maximum challenge. Like, I will absolutely call things out that are harmful, or where people have bought into stereotypes and they're not interrogating it. And it's always this really fine line of like, I'm coming to you with kindness, and actually kindness means that I will hold you to account. And another feature, I think, of whiteness, so for me as a white woman, I'm very used to like society trying to make me comfortable, and society trying to sort of like shelter me from having to think through the impact of my actions. So there's a lot of like, oh, well, racism is terrible, but it's out there and it's over there, without an accompanying emphasis on like, what are you doing as a white woman to prop this up all the time? What are your, it doesn't have to be as overt as calling the police on an innocent man who's just doing some bird watching. There's all these small ways in which we're sort of feeding into those harmful behaviors. And I wish I had like a clear and crisp answer for how you can, as an individual, give yourself that kindness to be like, yeah, I'm part of systemic harm and I'm doing my best to challenge it. And I recognize that that's hard work and it's daily progress, versus also being as strict with ourselves as we should, which is like coming back to what you said about when you know better, do better. It's like, we have got to develop, all of us, a really, really fast reflex for figuring out, I can do better here and I need to. And it just doesn't need to come from a place of attack. It can come from a place of self-love and love for other people. But it's 2024. Like, there's no excuses. The information is out there, and we will find it, or it will come to us.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. I have really, really enjoyed our conversation. I think what is always so powerful is that, we are so aligned on the way that we see things and what we're trying to achieve. But, obviously on paper, or, in kind of the history books, we're really different, right? And I think it's really, really powerful when we come together and talk about these things to show that actually, if we're working on it together, um, then it's about us. And I say this as well, it's quite cheesy, but inclusion is about us. Like, it's an us thing, it's not a me thing. And I think the sooner we understand that actually inclusion is about making sure that all of us, can be and do whatever we want to do, I think, yeah, it would just be absolutely amazing. I love to end these recordings with a call to action for our listeners. And I always kind of go to you. What would your call to actions be for anyone listening? Anyone that's listening to this conversation is thinking, okay, I love what you've said, but what can I do?
So I'm going to quote my dear friend and collaborator, Suleiman Khan, who is an anti-ableist activist and educator. And he always says, what is the smallest action you can take right now? And I would encourage you, when you're thinking about any space that you want to get involved in, or you're seeing a big systemic issue in your workspace, I know that for me personally, I can go quite quickly to overwhelm from that, and then I'm going to do nothing. So when you're setting your intentions for how you're going to smash the whole of white supremacy, I would suggest, can you give yourself a moment to ask, what's the smallest thing I can do, and do it right now? Don't try and change the world in 5 minutes, but do give yourself, again, it's that sort of paradox of having really, really big goals and needing to keep it on a manageable human level. So that would be my call to action. Keep it small and keep going.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like we've covered so much, and there's definitely something for everyone listening to take away from this. I think the biggest thing is, this isn't about shame. It's not about blame. It's not about any of that. It's about, how do we balance the scales now? This is the world we've inherited, right? How do we, as the people that occupy it at the moment, make it better in every way we can? So, Ettie, thank you so much for joining me. I've really, really enjoyed our conversation. And I love that you've joined me on what is probably one of the hottest days of the year, where we're both really uncomfortable. But we have had an amazing conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Grace. It's been a pleasure.